But there's a structurally racist element to this because it's essentially a huge wealth transfer from this predominantly African-American labor group to this predominantly white management group. And like going back to our previous thing we just talked about, the labor that happens to be mostly African-Americans not getting their fair share and their rights are not being protected by the government. So that's got some pretty bad historical echoes if you think of it that way.
Welcome to the Edge of Sports podcast. I'm Dave Zirin. This week, we speak to journalist Patrick Ruby about the latest scandals involving the FBI's investigation into college basketball. Now, for those of you who aren't aware of the backstory on this, a couple weeks back, two Yahoo writers, Pat Forty and Pete Thamel, published the contents of spreadsheets that the FBI took from the office of former NBA agent Andy Miller. We now know that the FBI has wiretaps, and witnesses suggest that dozens of high-profile basketball programs and players could be charged by the NCAA or perhaps even the federal government. We're talking Duke, Michigan State, Kentucky. We're talking big time here. And I can't think of anybody better to help us wrap our heads around it than Patrick Ruby. After Patrick, we'll have our Just Stand Up and Just Sit Your Ass Down awards and so much more. And we got a special shout out to Edge of Sports patrons coming up towards the end of the show. But first, Ruby Tuesday himself, Patrick Ruby. So Patrick, for listeners who aren't immersed in this issue the way we are, I want to make sure we take people along on this journey. On the most basic level, what is wrong with how NCAA athletes are treated in revenue-producing sports? And what do you say to people who say, why aren't scholarships enough?
So there's two things that I think on the basic level that are wrong, and they're related. The most basic thing that most people understand, if they pay any attention at all to the economy of major college sports, is it's a billion-dollar business. The athletes are the on-field labor force in this billion-dollar entertainment business, and they get an extremely small cut of the money pie. They do not get a fair cut. That's the most basic thing that almost anybody can see. The related thing that's truly wrong, and I think is actually more basic, is the reason why they don't get a fair cut. And the reason why is because all the schools get together through what we call the NCAA. You can call it a union of schools if you like. They have something called amateurism, and they tell all those athletes what you can earn from sports, what you can earn from your labor, what you can learn from your entertainment product is limited to what we say. And what we say is a scholarship plus whatever else we want to throw in. So in other words, they don't enjoy the rights the rest of us have to negotiate for the best deal possible, whether it's as a union or individually. They are not allowed to pit the schools that otherwise compete for their talents against each other to get the best deal, the way all the rest of us are in our own lines of work and our own lines of productivity. And again, the reason they're not able to do that is because of amateurism. And the only reason the schools are able to do that and impose amateurism is because our government will not apply antitrust law to college sports. The rest of us are protected by laws that are set up to encourage competition and let all of us sort of realize our market value. Athletes are treated like second-class citizens when they're in college and not allowed to do that. The government should protect them. It doesn't. So those are sort of the two most related basic reasons why this isn't a fair or just system.
Now, you've also written that there is a racial dynamic here that we'd have to be blind to ignore. I mean, you wrote a heavily researched piece that was more than just someone putting out a tweet like, hey, NCAA is a plantation, seems kind of racist. But
right.
You wrote about how the racial dynamic is central for understanding how the NCAA is able to get away with this. Now, can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, for sure. So in terms of racial dynamics, there are really like two pieces, again, that fit together here. The first one is that if you look at who generates the money and where it goes, you have a predominantly African-American on-field workforce, essentially, whether you want to call it sports business, entertainment business, a college marketing business, all of the above, a television production programming business. That's what big-time college sports is. The on-field performers are not exclusively, but they're majority African-American. They're the ones who are most responsible. They're not solely responsible, as is the case in all lines of work, but they're most responsible for the billions of dollars of revenues being generated. And the lion's share of that money does not go back to them. It goes to coaches, administrators, non-revenue sport athletes. It goes back to fans in a way in terms of potentially lower ticket prices. And if you look at all the people who are collecting the lion's share, they're not exclusively, but they're predominantly white. So what you essentially have, and again, I'm not saying that this system was set up to be this way, because when amateurism was set in college sports were segregated, colleges were segregated. So it actually wasn't created out of racism. And I don't think the people in the system are a bunch of like evil mustache twirling racists. You know, I've criticized Mark Emmert and his cronies quite a bit. I don't think they sit around at night, you know, like logging on to Daily Stormer, right? Like I don't think that's what's going on. But there's a structurally racist element to this because it's essentially a huge wealth transfer from this predominantly African-American labor group to this predominantly white management group. And like going back to our previous thing we just talked about, you know, the labor that happens to be mostly African-Americans not getting their fair share and their rights are not being protected by the government. So that's got some pretty bad historical echoes if you think of it that way.
And oftentimes racial ideology follows material reality, not vice versa. So it's set up, the NCAA is set up as this kind of white, for white athletes, a lot of Ivy League athletes, children of privilege to play college sports. But as it became this de facto minor league for the NFL and the NBA, new ideologies develop out of that. So the reasoning that you hear given, even though they're not twirling mustaches and watching Daily Stormer, the reasons that you often hear given for why you can't pay these athletes, which are rooted in, you know, in youth and irresponsibility and maturity.
Paternalism.
Very loaded terms with a lot of paternalism, and certainly terms you never hear applied to youth Olympians or golfers or tennis players.
Not at all. We should be real about it. There is a huge echo. Again, I'm not accusing any one person of being racist, but there's an echo here, at least culturally, historically, of the white man's burden. You'd have to be totally ignorant of history to not see that, to see the parallels. And again, these same rules also affect white athletes. So that's true. Like there are white athletes in the non-revenue sports who are also being denied their full sort of economic place at the table. Someone like Misty Franklin, a swimmer of Cal, who's a gold medalist who could make a lot of money for endorsement, has to give that up to swim in college. Why can't she do both? There's no real reason. So I don't want to say that it's all racial and everything's race, because that would be simplistic and wrong. But we have to be honest about that's a part of it. And we should look at that part and understand it. And the third thing that this jumps to is sort of public support or lack of support for the status quo, right? And when you look
which varies dramatically on the basis of race, when you look at percentages.
It does, which is very interesting. You look at surveys, and in general, it's moving more and more in favor of allowing athletes to be compensated. It's been moving a lot more that way in the last 10 years than it ever was before. But you're right. When you look at sort of how that breaks down, still at this point, African Americans and minorities are predominantly in favor of that, you know, over 50%. I think it's 60% or higher at this point now. I have to go back and double check the most recent polls. And a majority of whites are still opposed to college athletes being allowed to be compensated freely. And if you dig into that further, some people that do this kind of research on, politics and public opinion polls in terms of policy, they decide to look at people's attitudes towards college sports, towards athletes being paid. And they discovered that there was also a strong correlation between if you were opposed to this and how strongly you were opposed to the idea of athletes being paid, you tended to score higher on measures of what's called racial resentment. And this is a phenomenon that's been studied a lot, again, in public policy and politics. So it's pretty well understood by social scientists. There's controversy over it. There's debate, as there is in all social sciences, but it's not some crazy, wild idea that there's no data and no history of scholarship behind. And the idea of racial resentment, it's very important, I think, for your listeners to understand. Racial resentment, again, it isn't like the mustache twirling racism that we're used to, like in sort of movies. It's not like, I'm white and I think black people are filthy animals, right? It's not that out there. It's more like, hey, I'm white and, everybody knows that, black people are lazy, right? It's still racist, but it's a little bit different. And it's the kind of thing that informs public policy decisions. People will say, I'm not racist. I just don't support welfare because it goes to lazy people, And when they think of, you ask them, what do you think of a lazy person? It's a black person. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's justifiable. I'm not saying we should support that or be even sympathetic to that. But it is a little bit different. It's why people can say that and have that kind of belief and also say that I'm not racist, right? I got nothing against black people. They just happen to be lazy, right? It's like terrible attitude. But so it's a little more subtle. The thing they're trying to pick up on when they study this is more subtle. And they do see a correlation between people who don't want to let athletes be paid and have higher levels of racial resentment.
And it's highly systemic, and it's no coincidence that the high support for this is in the southeast of the United States, partly in the power conferences in the Southeastern Conference. I mean, there's a lot at work here that speaks to racial attitudes in this country. And it's one of those things, too. I'll just say that you mentioned before, it reminds me also of, it's true that the majority of people on food stamps in this country are white, and yet they are not made the face of food stamps, partly to build resentment against all people who need public assistance. And so similarly, while so many people so many athletes are damaged by the current NCAA system, they make the face of the NCAA system often people who are the easiest to demonize.
Oh, I agree with you. And in some ways, that's also the de facto face of it because it's the two most popular sports.
Exactly.
But we should note that. You make a really good point here, which is all athletes are hurt by this. Everyone who's being denied their basic economic rights and protections is being hurt here. If you look at sort of even the recent history of NCAA quote-unquote scandals and impermissible benefits, it is often, but not always, the big, powerful football and basketball programs. You see Division III women's basketball where or tennis, players are getting housing, they're getting meals they're not supposed to get. Lots of athletes have value at some level that they're not able to capitalize. Just because it's not necessarily they're creating a lot of value through a huge TV contract, they still might have some value locally. They still have value to their school. Any school that's trying to win and competing against another school and therefore needs to get better athletes from the other school, those athletes have value. Those schools have to bid. That's the whole trick of the NCAA, is to take out competitive bidding. It's literally something that every conservative in America should be unable to tolerate. That's what. And then we talk about the Southeast Conference. One of the interesting things is you see sort of the strongest love of something like college football in a place that's most politically conservative, and yet the politically conservative beliefs about the free market aren't trained on college football. And maybe that does tie into the race stuff. Although we should also admit about the American South, a very evangelical place, right? At least on the surface. But plenty of people down there are breaking all sorts of evangelical rules, on the down low all the time. And the SEC, at least for football, is notorious for probably having the most under-the-table payments going to athletes. So there's a lot of contradictions that are interesting here too.
Oh, sure. No, absolutely. And the setup is not dissimilar to, this is why when people get upset when people make slavery comparisons or say plantation. But one of the things that, in Bill Rhoden's book, $40 Million Slaves, he speaks about how there was an economy on plantations for great athletes. It's not like they weren't paid. It's not like all slaves weren't paid, particularly the ones who were able to be entertained. Now, and like with college sports, they were paid sometimes with really immoral things, like whether it was handing them women, whether it was making sure their families had extra food. It wasn't an honest and open fair exchange of labor value, precisely because that's not how